At exactly 6:47 p.m. on a deceptive Tuesday evening, the oxygen seemed to vanish from the British atmosphere as a 14-word statement detonated with the force of a nuclear warhead. Without warning or mercy, Buckingham Palace, the very bastion of tradition and silence, stripped away the veil of privacy to announce a formal review into certain inconsistencies surrounding the birth of Master Archie. The world came to a stifling standstill. This was no longer the buzzing of tabloid gnats or social media fringe theories, but a cold, institutional strike that targeted the heart of the line of succession. A collective sense of dizzying shock rippled from the gates of Windsor to the shores of California, as the realization set in that the crown itself was publicly dismantling the legitimacy of its own blood. In Montecito, the silence was shattered by a phone vibrating with such violent persistence, it felt like a countdown to an explosion. Harry watched, breathless and paralyzed, as the screen lit up with alerts from the BBC, Reuters, and The Guardian, his face draining of all color in the harsh light. The sheer horror of the moment was visceral. It was the sickening realization that the firm he had both defended and defied had finally pulled the trigger on a truth he thought was buried forever. The palace hadn't just issued a correction. They had declared a constitutional war, and as the initial tremors of panic subsided, a far more terrifying question began to emerge from the wreckage. What devastating evidence had the palace's silent investigators finally unearthed to make such a catastrophic public betrayal inevitable? The air inside the palace's private offices hadn't just turned cold, it had turned clinical. For years, a dossier of discrepancies had been quietly compiled, a meticulously organized file that transformed flickering suspicions into a terrifying, undeniable reality. This wasn't a collection of gossip. It was a cold-blooded audit of a miracle that never quite added up. The first crack in the foundation was the silence of the medical establishment. In the rigid world of royal protocol, a birth is a matter of state, requiring signatures from attending physicians and official verification from the hospital. Yet, from the Portland hospital, there was nothing. No names, no signatures, only a void where history was supposed to be written. The language used by the Sussex's team was analyzed by linguistic experts with calculating precision, noting how they relied on the passive, detached phrase, "The Duchess has given birth," a linguistic sleight of hand that avoided saying she had delivered the child. As the pages turned, the dossier moved from missing paperwork to the unsettling physics of the pregnancy itself. Images that the world had once dismissed as conspiracy theories were subjected to forensic scrutiny by medical professionals. They observed the shifting bump, a protrusion that seemed to change size, height, and density in a way that defied every biological law of late-term gestation. The mood in the room was one of sharp, biting skepticism as experts reviewed footage of Meghan's movements, noting positions and physical feats that should have been medically impossible for a woman days away from delivery. It was as if they were watching a carefully choreographed performance rather than a biological reality, and the palace's investigators were no longer willing to applaud. However, the most calculating and devastating blow came from an unexpected source, a golden witness from within the inner sanctum. This individual, under sworn testimony, described a specific, distinctive physical characteristic on Archie, a detail so private and minute that only someone who had been in the room during the most intimate moments could know. But there was a fatal flaw. This physical mark, documented with chilling accuracy, directly contradicted the medical timeline provided by Harry and Meghan. It was the smoking gun that proved someone had lied, not just to the public, but to the crown itself. When Prince William finally laid his eyes on this testimony, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the walls were closing in. He realized that this wasn't just a family secret, it was a ticking time bomb buried at the base of the throne. He looked up at the advisors, his eyes devoid of warmth, and asked the only question that mattered for the survival of the monarchy. A question so sharp, it would force Harry to fly across the Atlantic in a state of total collapse. If this witness is telling the truth, then whose child is currently sixth in line to my throne? The flight across the Atlantic was a descent into a private hell. Prince Harry sat in the cabin of the private jet, his world spinning in a vortex of suffocating panic. For years, he had operated under the belief that he was the hunter, the rebel, dismantling an archaic firm. But as he watched the British coastline appear through the clouds, a stunning realization took hold. The institution hadn't been defeated. It had simply been waiting. He was no longer the protagonist of his own story. He was a man caught in a pincer movement between a truth he couldn't remember and a family that had finally stopped protecting him. The air in the plane felt thin, leaving him gasping for breath as he realized that for the first time in his life, the palace machine wasn't spinning for him. It was grinding him down. When he finally stepped into the secluded room at Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was deathly cold. There were no cameras, no Netflix crews, and no Meghan. There was only William, standing like a marble statue of the crown itself. The silence was strangled and heavy, a physical weight that made Harry's knees weak. He had come prepared to rage, to shout about betrayal and leaks. But the sight of the thick dossier on the table, the same one he had seen in his nightmares, silenced him instantly. William didn't greet him with anger. He greeted him with a gaze of clinical, heartbreaking detachment. It was the look of a king in waiting performing an autopsy on his brother's life. Then came the question that caused the room to tilt on its axis. William leaned forward, his voice a low, vibrating hum of authority. "Harry, look me in the eye. Did Meghan actually give birth to Archie?" The world stopped. Harry's heart hammered against his ribs so violently it felt like it would burst. He wanted to scream, yes. He wanted to throw the table over in a fit of righteous fury. But as he searched his mind for the concrete, unshakable memory of that day, he found only a blur of shadows, frantic whispers, and a narrative he had been told to repeat until it became his own reality. His face drained of all color. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and in a moment of pure, raw devastation, he choked out the words that ended his life as he knew it. "I don't know. I don't know for certain." The admission hung in the air like a lethal gas. Harry was stunned into a hollow shell, realizing that the woman he had sacrificed everything for had built their foundation on a shifting sand of truths he had never actually witnessed. He had become a stranger to his own history, a pawn in a game so deep he hadn't even known he was playing. But as Harry sat there, broken and unmasked, William didn't offer a hand of comfort. Instead, he slid a single legal document across the table. A document that proved the palace wasn't just questioning a birth. They were preparing to execute a plan that would leave Meghan Markle with nowhere to hide. In the gilded isolation of Montecito, the atmosphere didn't just crack. It shattered under the weight of a frenzied, white-hot fury. Meghan Markle paced the length of her marble halls like a caged predator, her screams echoing against the high ceilings as she watched her carefully curated empire dissolve in real time. This was supposed to be her game, her narrative, her rules. But the palace's surgical strike had bypassed her PR shields and struck at the very marrow of her identity. She lunged for her phone, barking orders at her legal team to burn the palace down with defamation suits and discovery threats, only to be met with a silence so cold and terrifying it made her blood run like ice. Her lawyers, once so bold, now spoke in hushed, trembling tones. "We cannot fight them, Meghan. They have the records. If we open discovery, they will open the vault." The realization that she was powerless against the crown triggered a primitive, visceral fear that she had never known. She was a woman who had mastered the art of the sleight of hand, but for the first time, she was staring at a mirror that refused to lie. As her advisors hovered nervously, trying to formulate a defense for a birth story that was leaking like a sinking ship, the pressure became unbearable. In a moment of uncontrolled, jagged rage, she spun around, her eyes wide with a manic intensity that silenced the room. "Don't you understand?" she hissed, the words slipping out like a lethal confession. "It's impossible to prove anything about the woman who gave birth when the world only sees what I allow them to see." The room went deathly still. The slip was catastrophic. In her blind desperation, she had just voiced the very doubt the world was whispering, shifting the narrative from if to who. The masks were off, and the loyal staff who had stood by her now exchanged glances of pure, dawning horror. But the true blow, the one that made her knees buckle and her breath hitch in a jagged sob, was the silence from London. Harry wasn't calling. The man who had been her shield, her sword, and her greatest conquest had vanished into the bowels of Windsor Castle. And for the first time, she couldn't reach him with her words. She realized with a sickening jolt of terror that Harry's devotion wasn't to her, but to the truth he believed she represented. Now that the truth was fractured, she was no longer a duchess or a wife. She was a liability. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting long, skeletal shadows across her mansion, Meghan felt the walls of her own making closing in. She was alone, cornered, and the institution she had tried to outrun was about to deliver a final, public blow that would make the birth controversy look like a mere preamble. The palace wasn't just investigating a birth anymore. They were preparing to invite the British Parliament to decide if the Sussex name deserved to exist at all. The crisis had transcended the petty theatrics of celebrity and the emotional turmoil of a broken family. It had entered the hallowed, stone-cold corridors of Westminster. Within 72 hours of the palace's detonation, the British Parliament invoked a power not seen in generations. The atmosphere was one of grave, suffocating formality as the Succession Clarification Working Group was convened behind locked doors. There were no cameras, no emotional pleas, and absolutely no room for negotiation. This was the state in its most rigid and unyielding form, operating with the terrifying efficiency of a guillotine. The monarchy, as the Sussexes were about to learn, does not breathe through popularity or Instagram likes. It survives solely on the ironclad pillars of legitimacy, verifiable lineage, and the sanctity of the bloodline. The legal opinions presented to the committee were written in a tone of clinical ruthlessness. If a birth in the line of succession is misrepresented, even by a fraction of a degree, it is not merely a scandal, it is a fraud against the Constitution itself.